Afternoon, everyone, and I'm very pleased to be able to join you today and for this invitation. As your first speaker, I will share a high-level EU policy perspective to the issue that Tillman has just shared with us on the issue of associations and nonprofit organizations, which I will refer to as NPOs. The framework for the policy and regulatory framework for these type of organizations has so far been primarily developed at the national level. There is currently no harmonized pan-European legislative framework allowing nonprofit organizations to operate and organize themselves at the cross-border level. This leads to the challenges that Tillman pointed out with funding gaps and how can we facilitate these kind of actions. From an EU perspective, the completion of the European single market means that NPOs too should also enjoy the full freedom for cross-border activities, just as commercial businesses and economic interest groups already do. So I will start today from a broad perspective and then focus on a recent initiative of the European Parliament, which has called for EU legislation to promote cross-border activities of nonprofit organizations. This initiative was done in February last year. And as a policy analyst in the research service, I contributed to a study that provided research input into this initiative. So before I jump into this, though, I'd like to share with you a bit of the history of how we've come to where we are now. And then I will then tell you more about the current state of play in the EU debate and what the legislative options are now on the table. Would you change the next slide, please? Thank you. So there's a long history to EU interest in promoting nonprofit organizations. The history goes back really to 1987, when the president of the European Parliament, a woman named Nicole Fontaine, authored a report on nonprofit making associations in the European community. This report is known as the Fontaine Report, and it already put forward the idea of a European status for European associations. So in 1991, the European Commission put forward its first proposal for a council regulation for a statute. But there was a lot of criticism of this proposal from different member states, and the proposal was eventually withdrawn in 2005. Some member states argued that it violated the principle of subsidiarity. This means that member states should be able to act on their own, and there's no need for EU action. Some also criticized specific provisions of the proposal, for example, the requirement for associations to undergo audits on an annual basis. For all these various reasons, the proposal was withdrawn, yet the Parliament has continued to call for action here. It put forward a proposal in 2011, followed by a manifesto that was signed by a number of NGOs that called for this European statute. And again, in February last year, the European Parliament put forward another resolution that is calling on the Commission for the statute. In this resolution, it identifies the need to introduce a new legal form at the EU level to set rules on the establishment, the transparency, the accountability, and the governance of a European association. And these are for associations overall in general, and these can include associations in different sectors. The European Parliament considers that nonprofit organizations are fundamental to representing the interests of citizens in civil society, and that the representation of civil society should be on the equal footing of that of commercial businesses and economic interest groups. It should also include both membership and non-membership based associations, which is also an area of contention. The European Parliament highlights often the Article 63 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union that enshrines the freedom of association at all levels and protects nonprofit organizations against discriminatory, unnecessary, and unjustified restrictions regarding the financing of activities, which is key to the discussion today. Following the European Parliament's initiative, the Commission is expected to put forward a proposal this year. We are expecting to see it between April and June. So it will be in the next quarter already. So I'd like to share just a bit of data just to set the scene on nonprofit organizations. Our study found that there are about 5,000 international nonprofit organizations in the EU, which are on average each is operating in about 9 member states. And they cover a wide range of sectors. Today we're talking about private land conservation, but it's really very broad. It's a big sector. They promote different areas of civil society. Next slide, please. What's also interesting is that the numbers are really growing over time. Here in Brussels, where I'm based, there are a growing number that represent various economic, civic, cultural, educational, environmental, or regional interests. There are also cross-border regions that draw on civil society activities that are facilitated by MPOs. So while the amount of cross-border financial flows has increased substantially over the last decade, in line with the increase of international MPOs, the funding levels are still well below domestic levels. And this is because of a variety of legal and administrative hurdles. I don't need to go into detail with these with you because you're very aware, I'm sure, but just to mention a few, it's not just about tax incentives, it can also be about opening bank accounts, accessing public benefit measures, hiring staff, and there's a variety of different problems. Our study identifies 4 key problems that are very that we kind of group together everything and which is important for EU action to address. The first is that we lack a consistent set of definitions and data in MPOs. There's a wide diversity. I think the slides can be pulled down now. I can just speak to the camera. It's nice to see people too. Thank you. So there's a wide variety of types of MPOs, and there's just a huge diversity. We don't have data and also up-to-date information on activity, expenditures, and revenue. It's important to have a sense of how big the sector is and to understanding how much they're affected and what the benefits of policy action can bring. The second problem is the fragmented approach to tax exemptions, which is a key issue for today. And while establishing and registering an MPO is relatively straightforward, let's say relatively straightforward, obtaining tax exempt status is more demanding, and there's very big differences across member states. The differences are driven by 2 issues. One is about the definition, the sectoral border between what's private for profit or business, and the second is the border with the political system in place. The third issue we investigate in our study is about the barriers to cross-border charitable donations more broadly. And here it's that member states recognize the need to regulate these cross-border contributions, but they differ in how they do it. And in general, there's a big difference in tax law in countries. Some discourage MPOs to even build up and manage financial reserves or investment, which makes longer-term planning difficult. And there's a lot of, this leads to major disincentives. And so tax exemptions on charitable donations typically only apply to tax resident entities and not those from other countries. You're very aware of these issues. This relates to the fourth issue we identified, which is quite key. And this is about comparability procedures. Most member states do not offer a formal or uniform approach to testing comparability. This is how they recognize if a foreign charity can be recognized as a charity. The competent tax authority typically does it on a case-by-case basis. And this leads to a lot of legal uncertainty. This also creates a lot of compliance and legal costs for MPOs. It falls primarily on them, on the charity, because they must become familiar with the national legislation. In our study, we estimate that the cost that European foundations face is on the order of 90 to 100 million euros per year, sorry. And these costs can be especially burdensome for small MPOs, and it can also be very difficult for large MPOs. In our study, we find that the best comparability procedures out there are in the Netherlands and Luxembourg. These seem to provide the best examples. For example, in the Netherlands, the application procedure can take about 4 to 6 weeks. And so, as I mentioned before, this comparability links closely to the cross-border recognition of tax incentives. There are 3 cases that the European Parliament has looked at quite closely and which can provide a basis for EU action. There's one case from 2006 known as the Stauffer case, where the courts ruled in favor of an Italian NGO to be exempt of property taxes in Germany. There was another case in 2009, a case known as the Pirsch case, where the European Court of Justice ruled in favor of a German donor seeking to make an in-kind contribution to a Portuguese nonprofit care home. And then last of all, there was a case in 2011 that ruled in favor of a Belgian citizen who appointed a German MPO as its heir. Another issue which is interesting to highlight is the lack of member state action to date, and actually the attention, I would say, mainly on controlling international money flows and the issue of terrorism funding and the terrorism risk in philanthropic channels and networks. So there's a lot of attention to controlling and monitoring funding, which can also add another burden on charitable contributions. So the research we conducted finds that EU action is justified to address these 4 problems. Reducing and removing restrictions could promote the internal market, a healthy civil society, and the protection and promotion of EU values. In the case of private land conservation, EU action could also generate benefits for the environment, of course. So the European Parliament has called for the Commission to consider adopting a proposal to facilitate mutual recognition between the member states to recognize public benefit tax-exempt organizations, including philanthropic organizations in every member state. This mutual recognition can be done through more soft procedures, but it could also have a more, let's say, stringent approach. So there's a spectrum of approaches. One possible option, the most stringent option, is a proposal for a statute for European association. This is what the Parliament is very much in favor of. It would be a regulation, and it would require using the legal basis of Article 352. The challenge of this is that it requires unanimity in the Council. This means all member states voting in favor. And unfortunately, as we've seen from the past, this can be concerning. This may not be feasible. So the Parliament has been looking at other options. Another one could be to set common minimum standards using the article as a legal basis, Article 114. The problem with this one, this would be a directive, and so this is a bit softer. It's not a regulation, but it would not cover, it would not be able to apply to fiscal provisions. So the issue of concern today that we're talking about tax incentives, this would not be able to be directly legislated. This could only be done with the first one, the statute that would come with the regulation. So right now, the Commission, as I mentioned, is taking legislative action. They have done a stakeholder consultation. It's already closed, and now they are using the inputs from that consultation to prepare their proposal. They're also carrying out a study, similar to how we carried out a study for the Parliament. They also get external research to support their work. And so their research is underway now. It will inform their proposal, and it will go to Parliament eventually. So it should be between April and June. And that could be a good moment, I think, for NGOs, of course, to have a look at what is in this proposal, what is the option taken. We expect there's going to be a legislative part. So most likely the Article 114 I mentioned, the one which will have the directive, which will set common minimum standards, but not apply to tax. But there will also be a soft law, like a recommendation, which may try to facilitate mutual recognition. And this could be useful for the recognition of tax exemption. But we'll have to wait and see. And as I mentioned, it will go to Parliament for scrutiny and amendments. And that will be another process. So it will take another year from there. And that could be a moment for amendments and other changes. So with that, I stop. And thank you for your attention. And I look forward to any questions. Thank you.